I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the latest updates from the battlefront, look at the rising tensions between China and the West in Taiwan, and I speak to Dariia Tskyunova, partner of a Ukrainian soldier in the Azov battalion who was captured by the Russians after the siege of Mariupol.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 3rd of August, day 161. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, Dominic Nicholls, Assistant Foreign Editor, Venetia Rainey, Assistant Comment Editor, Francis Durnley, and our China correspondent, Sophia Yan. I started by asking Venetia and Francis for the latest updates from Ukraine.
Hi, yes. So one of the big updates to look at today is what's been going on in the south. Our listeners will be aware that the battle in Ukraine has very much shifted from the east down to the south, particularly around Kherson, which Ukraine is trying to retake. This is the strategic city that was the first to fall to the Russians right at the beginning of the war. And what we've heard today is that Ukraine has struck a key railway bridge between the Kherson region and Crimea, which is a landmass that Russia took back in 2014 in the original Ukraine conflict. Now, this railway bridge is really key because it's one of the ways that the Russians resupply their troops in the Kherson region. And what Ukraine has been trying to do is cut these troops off effectively to stop them from being able to get any resupplies, both in terms of equipment, fresh people, medical supplies. And Ukraine knows that if it can do that, then Russia's troops in the south will be stuck, and that will make it much easier for them to take them out. Separately but connected, we've also been hearing more about the power plant in Zaporizhia, which is very close by down in the south. Now, the Russians took that a few months ago, but it's been continued to be operated by Ukrainian staff because obviously they've been the ones that are running it. They know how it all works. We've been hearing for a while now that Russia has turned that power plant into a military base, essentially capitalising on the idea that Ukrainians wouldn't be stupid enough to fire something at the power plant, at the nuclear power plant, for risk of obviously creating an explosion. So we knew that they've been storing lots of their weapons there as a sort of safekeeping place. We're now hearing that Russia's been using it to strike Ukrainian positions, knowing that Ukraine can't fire back. We've been hearing from the IEA today that they think the situation in the power plant is out of control. They want to send inspectors in to see exactly what's going on. They've been hearing about lots of tensions between the Ukrainian staff and their Russian sort of overlords, if you will. And they're really worried that there could be an accidental escalation and that this could lead to, some kind of conflagration that would be even worse than what we're seeing on the ground in Ukraine. Obviously, this comes months after we heard lots about what happened in Chernobyl. The Russians took Chernobyl, the site of the nuclear disaster from the 80s, while they were trying to get into Kyiv. That ultimately failed and they retreated. And what we learned after they retreated is that they hadn't really been treating the site in the kind of way that you would expect with a nuclear site. They've been digging trenches, we believe, in the Red Forest where there's lots of nuclear waste still, where it's radioactively contaminated. They hadn't been treating, various equipment properly. So there's no certainty at all that the Russians, just because they're in one of the biggest power plants in Europe, that they're treating it with any kind of respect or following normal safety protocols. So I think quite right that the IEA is very concerned about this, and it's one to keep a close eye on.
Thanks, Venetia. Francis, do you have anything to add to that? I know you've got some other updates as well for us.
Well, yes, my only thought to add to what Venetia was saying there is we've talked a lot about Kherson in the recent days and indeed last week as this counterattack began. And indeed, I was speaking about the symbolic significance of this campaign for the Ukrainians. Of course, it's really important for them to be showing that they have momentum on their side at this critical juncture of the war. But I also think it's important as well, and this is something that I think no doubt the Ukrainians will be very sensitive to, this idea about expectation management. Because at the end of the day, whenever you're conducting a complicated offensive such as this, things may not be as clear cut as perhaps we would like. They may not be able to take back the entirety of the city in the short term. And and they may not be able to have this sort of moment which will show that the war is going in the direction of travel that they intend. So, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because ultimately they need to be. They're fighting this on a territorial front, of course, and a political front, but it's also this attritional war, which I've spoken about so often on the podcast, that the overall significance of this campaign is multifaceted. It's not just as simple as taking one city. And so I think, as I say, I'd be urging caution for those who seem to be thinking this sort of battle taking place around Kherson is of such unprecedented significance that the fate of the war is somehow going to be determined in the coming days, weeks, and potentially months, because ultimately this is going to be a long-scale battle, and we shouldn't just be looking for a short-term victory. It's something that needs to be seen in a much more complicated way and complex way, I think. So that would be my comment on Kherson.
Thanks, Francis. I know Dom's got something to add there, so we'll go to Dom just before we talk about the Phantom Bridges in the south and some of the impact of the HIMARS.
Yeah, hi David, hi everybody. All I'd add there, I wouldn't disagree with anything that Francis just said, and I would just add to it by saying that we've got to have a look at what Kherson is. Now, it is hugely symbolic. It's a large city. It was the first city of any great size to be taken by Russia. But in and of itself, how strategically or even operationally important is it? And I would put a big question mark against that. Russia needs to take the south. It's secure in Crimea. Russia is secure for the moment in the areas of the mainland, southern Ukraine, mainland bordering Ukraine. So Russia has the land corridor that it wants to get down to Crimea. It's got the launch pad to go west towards Odessa, and we know Russia wants to snuff out Ukraine's ability to be an independent, economically viable sovereign state. So Kherson in and of itself is not hugely strategically significant for Russia to either protect Crimea or push to the west. It's held Kherson for some months now and still has not been able to push to the west. And just holding Kherson and putting in the number of troops you'd need to defend a city of that size would denude the ability to protect the supply routes into Crimea. So flip that on its head and look at it from Ukraine's point of view. Does Ukraine want to take back Kherson? Of course it does, because it's its own territory. There's thousands of civilians in there, and they want to kick the Russian forces out of the country. But what does it? Bigger picture than that, what does it want to do? It wants to threaten Crimea. Ukraine wants to threaten Crimea so that Russia has to really draw back into protecting that and protecting the supply lines there. And Ukraine also wants to protect or deny Russia the ability to push west. So it might actually be not in Ukraine's immediate advantage to put a huge number of personnel and equipment into that, what would be a horrific urban fight to take that city. Perhaps isolating it and bypassing it, and therefore threatening, still keeping those forces in reserve to protect the west, Mykolaiv and Odessa and the rest of the Ukraine coastline, but have enough forces to threaten those supply lines into Crimea. That might be actually the bigger win here. Go back to sort of siege mentality and hold Kherson for another day, but isolate it and bypass it. Threaten Crimea. That, I'm sure, the potential loss of the supply lines into Crimea, I think, would be a bigger headache for Russia than the loss of Kherson.
Thanks for that. Dom, Venetia, I know we only have you for a few minutes, so do you have any more updates for us before we talk a little bit more about what Dom's been saying and the impact of Dom's own reporting?
So another story that we've been looking at today is HIMARS, one of our favourite subjects. It's emerging that Russia is so worried about the casualty rate from HIMARS that it's apparently trying to cover up the losses by underreporting casualties, transporting wounded soldiers away in civilian cars. And this sort of feeds into this overall story about how much impact the HIMARS are having in the war, and I'm sure Dom will have more to say on this subject. But we had Russia yesterday saying that it had destroyed 6 HIMARS. That's been heavily contested since. The Pentagon has said, no, we don't believe that's true. Ukraine has said, no, all 20 of the ones that we have in operation are still working just fine, thanks. But we know that HIMARS have been used to great effect to strike ammunition dumps, Russian ammunition dumps, to strike bridges, railways, infrastructure, and that they're being used very cleverly to really hobble Russia's war effort, in particular its ability to resupply and keep its troops supplied with weapons and other things that they need. Zelensky said last night that HIMARS are starting to equal justice in Ukraine, which is quite good language. We also saw something we reported on earlier this week, which sort of shows how concerned Russia is about the HIMARS, that they've been using sort of radar decoys, setting them up across the Dnieper River to try and fool HIMARS into thinking that there's a bridge there when there isn't. HIMARS don't work on radar, so it wouldn't work. But it does seem to fool some satellite pictures, so that's the sort of shows you how worried the Russians are about how HIMARS are tilting the balance against them in the war.
Well, thank you very much, Venetia. Thank you so much for your time. I realise you're going to sort of touch out of the studio now, and Sophia Yan is going to come in. Before we go to Sophia to talk about some of the tensions in Asia between China, Taiwan and the US and the implications of that to Ukraine and vice versa, the implications of what's been happening in Ukraine for what's happening in Asia. Francis, I know you had a question for Dom, and then we have a further question for Dom on his own reporting and the impact of that.
Yes, I just wanted to ask Dom, we've not really spoken much on the podcast about what it would mean for Ukraine to even attempt to take back Crimea, which of course was the territory seized in 2014. What kind of obstacles would they face there? I imagine that this would be a very heavily defended territory from the Russian perspective.
Yeah, Francis, I mean, you nail it on the head there. It would be extremely difficult. You've got the location, so the routes there, very small land route, not much option from the water either for Ukraine, and then you've got the time Russia has held it to fortify and put up the defences. So I think it would be an extremely difficult operation for Ukraine to take back Crimea. I think that's been reflected by the Ukrainian senior leadership. President Zelensky has never gone out and out to talking about when Crimea is back. He's been very measured in his language about that, as of every senior military and political figure that we've heard talking about it. It would be it's a massive task, not only in terms of the real estate of the size of Crimea, but also how long, as I say, how long Russia's had it. They've also built the bridge, the Kerch Bridge, and the railway bridge alongside it, which runs to the east, from the east of Crimea to mainland Russia. Memory fails me, but I think it's about 12 k's long, those the twin bridges. So I mean, able to be resupplied from there. Now, Ukraine showed in the last couple of weeks the ability to hit bridges and deny them to military traffic. Although the ranges here are much bigger than they are around where the HIMARS have been hitting so far near Kherson and Zaporizhia. So, question mark as to whether or not Ukraine could actually hit the Kerch Bridge. And also that little piece of sea across the Azov Sea, the northeast corner of the Black Sea, that's entirely in Russian hands. I mean, they would be able to resupply Crimea from the east fairly easily. So it would be a huge undertaking. I think Ukraine will leave that for another day. I think they are prepared to try and eject Russian forces back to at least the February 23rd line, if not beyond, but at least to the February 23rd line, and then take another look at this. They've shown themselves to be very pragmatic, very hard-headed about what they want and what is reasonable and what is possible. And I think that discussion about Crimea and the status there would be held for another day. But in terms of the military possibility of Ukraine taking it back, I think at the moment that is extremely unlikely.
Thanks for that, Dom. You're here. Just called in just to talk a little bit about some of your reporting. Your interview with General Skibitsky of the Ukrainian military intelligence. It was in the paper yesterday, and also listeners to the podcast will have heard it yesterday. There's been it's provoked a reaction from the Kremlin. Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, so last week when David and I were in Ukraine, I spoke to Major General Vadim Skibitsky, who's the acting deputy head of Ukraine's military intelligence, and we spoke about a whole number of things. As David said, it's in the paper today. The longer interview went out on the podcast last night. I think it was edited down. I think it's about 17 minutes ish. If you want to have a listen to that, it's excruciating for me to go and listen back, because all I can hear is all the ums and ahs and all the questions that I should have asked and ways I should have taken the interview. But hey, every day's a school day. But please do go and have a listen to that if you doubt my words, or if you want to see quite what the Kremlin's up to with their response. But basically, on the section when we were discussing HIMARS and the targeting of it, I was asking him how Ukraine is using the US supplied multiple launch rocket system and the targeting of it and what have you. And he was very clear, as I put in the paper. I mean, far be it from me to accuse the Kremlin of selectively quoting from a newspaper article. But as General Skibitsky said, he said that they are not getting US officials to provide targeting information. The US is not targeting the HIMARS systems that they've supplied. I mean, there's a little bit of sort of dancing on a head of a pin here. I mean, they've supplied the weapons, they've supplied the ammunition. That we know there's a lot of cooperation in intelligence matters, as I refer to again in the article, and as Major General Skibitsky said, there is a lot of intelligence cooperation. I mean, the West are supplying arms to Ukraine. I don't think anybody is not aware of that. But he was very clear that the US is not going as far as programming in the targets, pressing the button or whatever you press, and firing HIMARS. He said that. He told me, as I reported, that there is a level of cooperation with the US such that if there was any potential target that would cause the US diplomatic embarrassment and would be deemed to be too participatory, i.e. the Americans are taking an actual role in the war beyond supplying weapons, then those targets would not be hit. Now, how that conversation happens, whether or not it's human to human, the swivel chair interface, as it used to be known, just saying, look, this is what we're thinking of doing, this is how we're likely to employ them, these are the types of target we would seek to prosecute, and the US saying yay or nay, I'm not entirely sure. I can't imagine it goes down as far as, here's the coordinates, this is what we're going to do. Now, we know that there's extreme nervousness from Washington about ATACMS, which is also fired from the HIMARS vehicle, but instead of a pod of 6 227mm rockets, I think a 227, anyway, the HIMARS rockets, ATACMS is just one enormous great rocket that goes about 300 kilometres. And there was great nervousness about supplying that. To date, it has not been supplied by the US to Ukraine. But we do know that this level of conversation goes on. So we should not be surprised. I am not surprised that there is a level of discussion, a level of cooperation and coordination, if you like, between the US and Ukraine, with the US saying, we would not be happy for you to use these supplied weapon systems against these types of targets, blah, 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 blah. Now, as I said, that does not go down as far as the US pressing the button. Russia would have you think otherwise. The comment from Russia's defense spokesman saying, "Aha, here we go. This is evidence of US participation in the war." I mean, it is just selectively quoting, and I pay it no further interest than that. I mean, the fact that the Kremlin is reading the Telegraph, I'm delighted. I hope they're listening right now to this space and to the podcast. I'm very happy to get into a dialogue with Russia. I've asked them many questions, or I've supplied many questions since the war has started about the war. Strangely enough, they haven't come back with any answers at all, or they've shown themselves totally unwilling to engage with me. I'm very happy to engage. If you're listening now, boys, I'm very happy to engage. Come and answer some of my questions. Come on the pod. It'd be great to have you. But no, they are selectively quoting as they wish to put together a narrative that suits them. I mean, that's as old as time. We shouldn't be surprised by that. If you're in any doubt still, then I would urge you to go and have a listen to last night's pod. You'll hear the whole interview with General Skibitsky, and you can make your own mind up. But plot spoiler: the US are not firing HIMARS at Russian forces.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dom, and thank you for your reporting and for that interview. And just to repeat, if you do want to hear the full context and the full interview, do go to yesterday's podcast and give it a listen. Moving on, it's great to welcome Sophia Yan, our China correspondent, joining the podcast now. We're going to move away from Ukraine. We're going to zoom out a little bit and talk a little bit about the tensions in Asia between China, the US and Taiwan. Sophia, can you give our listeners just the lowdown of what's happening right now in the East?
So U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi touched down in Taiwan yesterday. She's now left, but this was a very high-profile visit, the most senior elected U.S. official to visit Taiwan in a quarter century. This is something, of course, that really upset Beijing. And Beijing, especially with Xi Jinping at the helm, has made it very clear that reunifying, this is how they describe it, reunifying the mainland with Taiwan is something that he has put his personal stamp on. And he's made clear that China is ready to do this by force if necessary. And so Pelosi's visit has escalated tensions between Washington and Beijing. Of course, ties between the two have frayed in a big way over the last few years. But now more than ever, especially given the context of Russia and Ukraine, it frankly seems like there's a division being formed between the free world and the not-so-free world.
And how has the Ukraine war changed how the Chinese and the Americans are dealing with each other in Taiwan?
Well, there were lots of reasons why Putin would have decided against invading Ukraine, yet he did it anyway. And so when that moment happened, I think a lot of people woke up to the possibility that this could happen with China and Taiwan. There are plenty of reasons still why Beijing wouldn't act now, one being that in the autumn there's a once in 5 years party Congress. This is when Xi is set to take on his unprecedented third term. And he's likely to want a stable, peaceful power transition into this next period of him in the top seat before taking any sort of big steps. There's some chatter that maybe this is the moment where he will feel the need to be a strongman, but the Chinese Communist Party generally values stability, all quiet on the home front around major political events. Generally speaking, the only person who knows what's going on in Xi's head is Xi himself. And there is, of course, this risk that he makes a pretty bombastic choice. There's a debate now about whether Pelosi's visit was good or bad. Some say it's great that there's more attention on the Taiwan issue and understanding over how aggressive Beijing has become over the years. And we're talking Beijing now much more powerful than it was before. This is very different from the last time a House Speaker, Newt Gingrich, visited Taiwan. So Beijing has a lot more firepower, too. But then the other side is, by doing this, is the U.S. then pushing China into a corner? And will China then act in ways that it may not have otherwise? Will it react more forcefully? So this is all being discussed. And it's really hard to say right now. It's too early to tell. Hindsight always 20/20.
Sophia, we've had you on this podcast quite a few times in the past. I mean, coming on to 6 months of the invasion of Ukraine. How is the invasion and the war understood by the Chinese public and the Chinese elites now, sort of 5-6 months down the line?
Well, China has really restricted news of the war in Ukraine. State media has made very clear where they stand. Generally, what's given to the public in China, to these 1.4 billion people, is the Russia line, that this is a special military operation. I mean, to this day, China has still refused to denounce Russia over the invasion. And so that makes it really clear where Beijing sits, at least on a values front. And so China, on the world stage, it's really in a tough place. Xi Jinping also with Russia has made this a personal thing. Xi and Putin had this wonderful bromance. Putin visited Beijing just before the invasion, just weeks before when China hosted the Winter Olympics. They always make a big show when they get together of how friendly they are, and they go out for drinks. They do this, they do that. It's something that he has made clear is a relationship that he values. But China and Russia aren't necessarily traditional allies. They are happy to work together where they agree and just to sort of disengage where they don't agree. But all of this, of course, has given China a template to understand what could happen if it were to move on Taiwan. China watching how the world has reacted to Russia has probably been very instructive. This means Beijing can now prepare in advance, for instance, how best to insulate against sanctions, reviewing whether its military is indeed prepared. I mean, this gives China a lot of lead time into thinking about what it needs to do if it wants to do something similar on Taiwan.
At the beginning of the segment, you talked about this potentially being a sort of crazy moment between the free and the not free world. How do you think the Taiwanese and the Americans see this? Do they see Ukraine and Taiwan as being part of the same ideological battle?
From the perspective of the West, I think Ukraine and Taiwan are representing much larger. It's beyond just these countries and their borders. This seems to be a very big values sort of issue right now that the U.S. and the U.K., the countries with democratic governments, are facing. When it comes to Taiwan itself, though, the jury's out. It's a very complicated issue on the island itself. It's only 23 million people. It's not very big. It's about the size of New Jersey, even less actually. And people are all over the place. Some people favor independence. Some people favor closer ties to the mainland. Politicians campaign on their platform of cross-strait relations, and they win or lose their campaigns based on what they have to say on that. But for the most part, the majority of Taiwanese residents sort of favor this fuzzy status quo. A lack of clarity means that they can just go about their daily business. And in that sense, having that gray area to operate in, not really defining where they are, in that sense, so far has seemed to work out for Taiwan. So that's why a visit like this that Pelosi has made is so interesting. It really just forces some more definition when in many cases, for many people, they don't want that kind of definition.
Thank you so much for that, Sophia. That was extremely fascinating. I'd like to just open the floor. Francis and Dom, do you have any questions for Sophia?
Yeah, just wondering, Sophia, I mean, I was doing some reading on Taiwan yesterday, and it was talking about the various different possibilities of its long-term prospects with this, as you describe, rather aggressive stance from China around reunification. I mean, obviously, there's the military option, which would be, pretty horrific, although there'd be no guarantee, I don't believe anyway, of that Taiwan would actually be able to be taken by China, not without very, very serious losses, given that the munitions that are already there. But my question is to what extent would it be possible, do you think, for China to play this like they did with Hong Kong and sort of sow internal dissent to the point that actually it's possible to subvert Taiwan's democratic states from within and then become more sort of part of China in that fashion, as opposed to through direct military confrontation?
So right now, Taiwan is different from Hong Kong because politically speaking, it is very much independent. It has a democratically elected government, and Beijing has no hand really in putting whoever that person is going to be in power. There are, of course, influence operations. China has, for a very long time, tried to have an impact on the outcome of the presidential elections, trying to make sure that there are candidates that are closer to the mainland, that favor closer ties, to give them a shot. But again, this is such a political issue on the island, and it goes back and forth as to which party might be in power and how they view the relationship with China. So that's the wild card. It's not exactly a direct comparison to Hong Kong. China doesn't really have the ability to enact and then enforce a law in Taiwan, like we saw in Hong Kong with the national security law. That can't really happen. There's not an apples-to-apples situation that could occur with Taiwan. But it is this issue of influence. If over time Beijing somehow is able to have enough supporters in Taiwan that favor reunification and, of course, don't want war, then we're looking at a very different scenario. The other area that China could use, the other way that China could pressure Taiwan is through economic coercion. And we're already seeing that. China's announced that it will block some Taiwanese imports. This is in Beijing's old playbook, to just try to squeeze when it's upset with another nation, in this case with the island of Taiwan. And so in this sense, there are many tools that China has in its toolbox to pressure Taiwan without going into all-out physical conflict.
Sophia, if I could ask a question, please. China has been building up its military at an incredible rate in the last few years. So I'm thinking the Ukraine war and Speaker Pelosi's visit today, if that is either of those or both of these have acted as a catalyst to bring the issue of Taiwan closer to us in time, there's not a lot China can do in terms of militarizing even faster because it's been going so rapidly in recent years. The idea that this might have brought the issue into sharper focus gives Taiwan time now to try and build up its defences and buy equipment and get its society ready. So I'm just wondering if you think that all these things considered means that it's more likely that something will happen in the short term And a bit like Roland was saying yesterday about the Balkans, the butterfly effect that a small thing over here can absolutely bubble up into having a large conflation elsewhere. I wonder if you think Nancy Pelosi's visit might actually be very provocative, or visits like it, issues like it, because it now seems like time is almost not on China's side. The longer there is not a confrontation, that's probably in Taiwan's favour, because it gives time to build up and prepare defences. As I say, there's not a lot else China can do to speed up its own militarisation. So I just wonder if you saw this potential confrontation coming closer towards us and more fragile, more likely to flare up in the event of events like this, or whether it pushes it to the right and pushes it further downstream and means that everyone's going to take stock and go, ooh, actually, this could be really bad, and the chances of confrontation are less likely.
This is one of the biggest debates in Washington about when it comes to Taiwan. What level of support and how visible can it be without tipping over, pushing Beijing into a corner? The U.S. does support Taiwan in terms of arms. Is that good or bad? It's good because then Taiwan is perhaps more prepared, but in doing so, does that mean that Beijing will take that the wrong way and then make a move? Pelosi's visit falls into the same category. Is it good? Is it bad? It's very hard to tell. Support, of course, from the U.S. might then send a message, a signal to Beijing that, hey, it's not a good idea to move on Taiwan right now. It's just so hard to tell. The thing that we have to understand, though, is that when China does decide to do this is going to be something that comes from the top ranks of the Chinese Communist Party. This is going to be something that is politically driven. And it will have to be at a point, as far as experts think, when China is confident that it can win. It would be a disaster if something like Ukraine happened, if China were to try to make a move and couldn't actually do it, and it was dragged out for months. I mean, it's much of what we're seeing now in Ukraine. I mean, it's a situation. It would be so embarrassing. It's a scenario that Xi Jinping would never want. And again, he's someone who's put a personal stamp, his stamp, on this issue. I mean, he warned Joe Biden directly in a call a few days before Pelosi was due to take off, and even that didn't really work because, of course, the U.S. government doesn't work that way. But he has made very clear that this is something he wants to stake his legacy on. That's the risk that we face. And so if he wants to make a move, then he definitely will. The question of when. And then there's a question of what would push him to make that decision. But again, it's hard to see how Beijing would decide to move on Taiwan if it weren't absolutely positive that it could win.
Thanks so much, Sophia. Just two quick questions from me. You said that if China attacked Taiwan and it ended up being mired in a 5-month, 6-month longer war with huge casualties like Russia has in Ukraine, that would be hugely embarrassing. That's something that Xi does not want, and they want to make sure they can guarantee victory before they even start. Do you think that the resistance of Ukraine and the success of the Ukrainian army in continuing to fight and fighting back against Russia has given Taiwan quite a lot of support and, vicarious support?
It seems inspiring in a way. It's like a David versus Goliath situation, isn't it? And so Taiwan is, tiny. You look at Taiwan on a map, it's like a dot next to the mainland China. I mean, you can just imagine it wouldn't take very much to annihilate the whole island, physically speaking. I mean, that's a bit sort of hyperbole. I'm speaking in broad strokes here, but it's a very small place, and you're up against the might of China. So I think right now, for a lot of people who are living there, a bit of support is always welcome. And having seen the kind of worldwide support there is for Ukraine and sort of how the country and its citizens have reacted to this invasion, I think all of that sort of gives a little bit of warmth, perhaps, in how they would view what could come to pass. But generally speaking, I would say for most of the people that live in Taiwan, this day-to-day, they're not so much thinking about the risk of war. They've lived with this potential threat for 70 years. It comes and goes. There are moments where the rhetoric is very aggressive. There are moments when it dies down. Right now, we're in a period of time where things are pretty intense. And you look at it in the context of what's happening elsewhere in the world, then you really have to wonder what could happen next, what could come to pass even more so in 2022, right? But generally speaking, it's not something that governs how people think. It's not necessarily something that dictates and dominates their day-to-day.
Well, thank you so much, Sophia. I just wondered, just to finish my questions, would you sort of just sum up for us what you think are the big parallels and similarities between the Ukrainian situation and the Taiwanese situation, but also what are the big differences? Because we don't want to try and pretend these two situations are completely the same.
I think some of the parallels is that before everything happened with Russia and Ukraine, there was a lot of discussion about why it couldn't happen, and a lot of people were convinced that it wouldn't. Of course, there were many people who were convinced that it would, but that discussion is not so dissimilar from the China and Taiwan discussion. There are many, many, many reasons why China wouldn't or couldn't possibly move right now, maybe in a few years' time. But then the wild card, of course, is what Xi Jinping thinks, what he would want to do. And that's something that nobody can really get at. The main difference is that this is an entirely different part of the world. And on a military front, it would be a very different kind of war. Taiwan is an island. It's not so easy to take Taiwan in a war. And this is a completely different political calculation for the guy in charge, for Xi Jinping. It's about his legacy. It's about whether or not he thinks this is going to be something that can bolster his credentials. He'd only do it if he really thought that was possible. And one thing to remember is that China is a nation of one-children families, primarily sons, because of a cultural favoritism for men. So if all of a sudden there was a war, people were being drafted in, what would that look like if families were starting to lose their sons? There's so many questions and so many what-ifs and areas details to consider for this kind of scenario.
Well, thank you so much, Sophia. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you for giving us your thoughts and your expertise on the situation in China and Taiwan. I think we're starting to come to the end of our time, so can I just ask all of our contributors for your final thoughts?
Sure. Well, I just would like to pick up on what Sophia was saying there about Taiwan. I mean, I think it's absolutely 100% true to say that you cannot underestimate how challenging it is to take an island by military force. I mean, for any listeners in the United States, the island campaigns during the Pacific War in the Second World War was particularly vicious, and single outcrops of land were defended by the Japanese with such force that it would take months sometimes to see small strips of land. So if that kind of conflict were taking place in Taiwan, then you can imagine that this is not an easy expedition from the Chinese perspective. If that's something they're actually calculating. But I just wanted to focus on one thing as a final thought that Sophia was saying there about this idea about the sharper focus and the bringing in of how Ukraine and to some extent Taiwan and other things have brought these big overbearing questions around democracy and autocracy really into the forefront of our consciousness once again. We've ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've lived in this sort of limbo where these kind of issues have been put to bed, or at least that was the perception. There was this naive ideological belief on the part of the West that China would eventually become more like the West, that Russia would too, that all one needed to do was open up one's wallet and that would be enough for liberalism and democracy to spread into those countries. Clearly now we see the naivety of that view. And I think that, perhaps this is a positive thing. And what I mean by that is, of course, the war in Ukraine isn't positive, and of course, what with the tensions that we're seeing are not positive. But what I mean is that if finally we're no longer operating in a space where we're willing to effectively engorge the enemies of free societies in the way that we have been for decades. And I think that will have to be something that now is a primary concern for all Western leaders, is the policy that we are enacting here enabling China? Is it part of untangling the web of interconnections between the Russian state on energy, on gas? These kind of things are now going to be at the forefront of the political dialogue. And I think that that's a positive thing, because if it had been part of the political discourse for the last 30 years, then Germany would not have been able to have, or wouldn't have wanted to tie itself to Russia in its dependency on energy. And China wouldn't have been enabled to become the enormous military power that it has, that is now capable of potentially long-term threatening Western hegemony, and that has been entirely enabled by Western foreign policy in terms of the investment and everything else, which may not have been done. So, as I say, in no way would I say that increased tensions are positive, far from it, but I would say that finally we are starting to understand the reality of the political world that we inhabit, and a geopolitical world that we need to really wake up to and haven't for many, many years. So that would be my final thought.
Well, thank you very much for that, Francis. Dom Nichols.
Thanks. I'm afraid I'm going to be a little glass half empty to Francis's half full. I think we are seeing a lot about the international order at the moment, and it's not looking good to me. So we are 6 months into this war, and we've had another example here of a provocative stance by a senior US politician. But the response from China is very, very heavy metal. It's very old school, blunt, hard diplomacy, or not even diplomacy, but a military response. And back to Ukraine, as I say, 6 months in, we still haven't seen any meaningful efforts, as far as I can see, from the United Nations to bring this thing to a stop. I mean, we're talking about day-to-day stuff, and we can talk longer term about sanctions and oil policy and what have you, but there's been nothing that I've seen to counter this idea that might is right still in the 21st century, that you'll get away with it if you chance your arm and your military is strong enough, you can do what you like. I think we are still seeing that in Ukraine. I think we've seen a display of that in Taiwan in the last 24 hours, and what might yet to come. There's nothing I can see that's suggesting to these great powers that that's not how the world wants to operate anymore. And there's no form of diplomatic or very, very obvious influential diplomatic work to say this is going to come at great cost to you. So yes, I think we're seeing history play out, but I think we're seeing more of the same, and it doesn't fill me with huge encouragement. And I'm sorry to end on that note.
Sorry to interrupt. I feel like I had to come in. I mean, I think it's so interesting hearing Dom's perspective, and I actually don't disagree with him. But I think that remains to be determined whether what the political direction will go in the long term. But I would say that, as pessimistic as we may be now about the state of play of the political elites and how they've conducted themselves, bear in mind that the democratic populations, certainly in Europe, have woken up to this. And as slow as the reaction of the political elite, particularly in Germany and France, that we've spoken about, has been, I think that there is now going to be an increased sensitivity on these issues amongst the population, and that will catch up, and that will have an influence as new leaders are elected in. Look at what's happening here in Britain. Liz Truss is the Foreign Secretary, incredibly hawkish on Ukraine and China. She's probably almost certainly about to become the next Prime Minister, and I think that may well be a trend that we see elsewhere.
Thank you very much, Francis, and thank you, Dom. Sophia, Jan, would you like the final thoughts? What should our listeners in Ukraine and the world be thinking of when we see on our news the tensions in Taiwan and China?
Well, Taiwan, you have to think about the bigger picture here, is that Taiwan is yet another flashpoint. China's relations are deteriorating with the U.S., also with other countries in the world. There needs to be a lot of deep thinking. Should there be engagement with China for engagement's sake? The call that just happened between Biden and Xi was months in the making. There were many meetings at lower levels to tee that up, but there were no deliverables at the end of that. So that's not great for Washington per se, but for Beijing that becomes a propaganda moment to show that Xi is powerful and influential enough to have such meetings with other world leaders. But the flip side of that, a lack of engagement, means that then there's potentially a higher risk of misunderstanding that could then spark into conflict. This is pretty dangerous. And so I think not just for the U.S., but for all governments, they need to be really, really considering how they want to be interacting with China in this moment.
Last week, Ukraine accused Russia of a false flag strike on a prison in Olonivka, in Kremlin-controlled Donetsk. The attack reportedly killed at least 53 Ukrainian prisoners of war. Russian-backed separatists claimed the pre-trial detention facility where members of Ukraine's Azov battalion were said to be held was struck by US-provided HIMARS rockets. Dariia Tskyunova's partner is Ilya Samoilenko, a member of the Azov battalion who was captured by the Russians. Dariia spoke to us from Ukraine. Here is our conversation. Dariia, first of all, would you just introduce yourself? Where are you from in Ukraine, and what was your life like before the invasion?
So, my name is Dariia Tskyunova. I'm 22 years old. I'm from Cherkasy, but currently I live in Kiev for more than 5 years for now. And I decided that I will become a psychologist, but Because of the Russian invasion, I hadn't had a chance to actually begin my studying, so I'm participating in the Association of Azovstal Defenders Families, which was created in the beginning of this summer, because our family members and our beloved ones are in captivity now, in Russian captivity in Donetsk People Republic, controlled by Russia.
So let's talk about that. Who is your loved one who's in captivity? Can you tell us about him?
Yeah, sure. His name is Dariia. He is an officer of the intelligence service. He was fighting Russians since 2015, but last summer he decided to go back to civil life, and he was working as a project manager in one of the, I suppose, American IT company. So he was doing quite well. But when the Russian invasion full scale began, he decided that he should rejoin the army and to defend our country from.
How did you feel when he said he was going to rejoin the army and go back and fight the invasion?
As we were friends before, I knew already that he always told that if the full-scale invasion will begin one day, he will definitely rejoin the army. So it wasn't a surprise for me. You know, actually, he went to Mariupol on the 19th of February. To teach the newcomers of the Azov regiment. He was given the lecture there, and he didn't take his ammunition in there, so he was only like books and notebook and other stuff with him. But when the full-scale invasion began, he was in Mariupol, so he decided to stay there, and I wasn't surprised. I supported his decision. I was also scared because it's a dangerous work. It's like 50-50 that you can be alive in the end of the war, but I knew that I shouldn't talk him off this decision.
So what happened to him at obviously Mariupol in the first few months? The defense of the steelworks, the defense of the city was huge news. We followed it every single day. What happened to Ilya in the end?
So in there, he was defending Mariupol in Ukraine for more than 80 days, 87 I believe. It was completely clear, even in the middle of the March, that the city is encircled, the Mariupol is encircled by Russians. And I remember that I tried to draw attention of international community even then to provide some help to deoccupy and or I forgot this word. Deblocate the city, but unfortunately that didn't happen, and the situation from the March was getting worse and worse every day. We decided to draw attention to this process, and we tried to reach authorities of foreign countries to provide this extraction for our soldiers, because they had horrible conditions in there. They had a few food. It's like maybe this plastic cups, yeah, some regular ones. So they had like this plastic cup of porridge, I guess. Yeah, boiled porridge or something like that for one person a day, only one cup for person, for grown-up man, and it was like too painful to understand that they would basically starve in there, and they could be dead from starvation. And I also need to mention that they were drinking technical water from they were based on the Azovstal plant, and this water was spoiled by all the oils and stuff, but they needed to drink it in order to live. The conditions were horrible. Many people were dying every day. When the video came out where Denis Redis told that they are living out of Azovstal, and we understood that the process of captivity had started. So they went to Russian captivity from there. And when Ilya was leaving Azovstal, it was on the 20th of May. He only wrote me that everything will be fine. Don't worry, stay strong. Go back to Ukraine and try to do something there to get us home as soon as possible.
Do you know now where he might be and what conditions he might be experiencing?
Actually, I'm not quite a person which can believe Russians or DPR's people. I cannot be 100% sure that he is in Olonivka camp, but according to the National Guard of Ukraine and International Red Cross lists, Ilya is staying in Olonivka, but I'm not sure about it. I can't be sure about it because we haven't been in contact for more than 2 months now. Since 20th of May. So I don't know if he is held there or if he is held, if he was transferred somewhere else. But I'm very afraid that he could be in that building which had exploded on 29th of July.
So on the 29th of July, we know that dozens of Ukrainian prisoners of war were killed in an explosion in Olonivka. From your reading of Ukrainian and Russian sources, what do you think happened?
So basically, I analyzed not only the Ukrainian sources, but I tried to get the full picture of what's going on. So I read a lot of Russian sources and a lot of international sources. I watched basically every video which came out from this camp, the place of explosion, and I saw all the pictures of the dead bodies in order to analyze what happened. Russians claim that this explosion was because of HIMARS, which were given to Ukraine. But as we can see from the pictures, the building is ruined, not like from HIMARS or something heavy like that. And the bodies which we can see on the pictures are also looking, this is the next part I wanted to tell about. Not all of them are looking like they were actually alive when the explosion happened. So I believe that Russia can try to hide some killed people from tortures in this fire. They're trying to hide this, and I also saw the bodies which were not damaged by fire, which were dead from the gas poisoning. So they're looking very skinny. I heard the thought of one of these professionals, and also he told that it looks like they are not like freshly dead. Maybe they were dead for several days.
So at the moment, you don't know if Ilya is alive or dead?
Yeah, I don't know. I hope that he is alive, but I don't know for sure, because we have only unofficial lists. Russia refuses to give us official list of names, and they refuse also to give us the bodies, give the bodies to Ukraine back. So I basically don't know if my boyfriend is still alive. I don't know. I hope so, but I don't know for sure.
You mentioned that you do now quite a lot of work with the Association of Azov-style defenders' families. Can you tell us about that? What kind of things are you doing?
Yeah, sure. So we are trying to communicate as much as possible with foreign journalists. We are trying to spread the information about the Azov-style defenders around the world. We are trying to make like educational mission about this, because I know that Russian propaganda worked very strongly for many years, and they created this image of Azov, that Azov are Azov regiment or some Nazis, but they are not, and we are trying to explain why. That we need Russians to follow the Geneva Convention, that we need to do this exchange as soon as possible, because we can't take that no more. We can't wait our soldiers to be dead in this captivity, you know. We cannot like hope for the best and do nothing. We need to do some actions actually. Also, we are helping the families of those people who are in captivity now. We are trying to explain them how they should behave with all those paperwork and lists, because when your relative is in captivity, you should call to National Guard of Ukraine, to Red Cross, to National Inform Bureau, and other instances, and give all the necessary information to them in order to make this process of exchange as soon as possible, and don't forget anyone to be mentioned in those lists. So then also we provide psychological help for the people who need it the most, because some of relatives are in a real stress now. I understand that not everyone can hold, like for example, me holding or Katya Prokopenko holding up, but some people have more fragile psychological state than we do, so they need special attention. They need to go to some sanatorium. So it's like the place where you can rest, where you can do the art therapy, and where you can like do the group consultations with the psychologist. So we provide that services too. So we need to make as easiest process of adaptation for them as possible.
When was the last time you communicated with Ilya?
On 20th of May, actually. I haven't heard from him for more than 2 months now. I don't know where he is or what he is.
Dariia, is there anything you haven't spoken about that you would want to say?
I just hope that this situation will be the last situation like this, and we will just get back our people home as soon as possible, because I personally believe that the heroes of Ukraine, the heroes of the world, who were defending not only Ukraine but the whole Europe and the whole world from Russia, deserve to have all the necessary conditions and deserve all the grace and care after this horrible period of time.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. And sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message, and we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, making her debut with the Telegraph social team, Claire Hubble.